Hey there, my name is Alex, I am the Silvermond, and in this video we're going to be talking about Dark Souls 2. In particular, we're going to look at the question, is Dark Souls 2 really that bad? We'll try and look at both sides of the discussion, and of course, if you have any points to share or questions to ask, please do down in the comments section. Quite simply, Dark Souls 2 is the black sheep of the franchise in many ways. From glancing through various message boards, forums, and even YouTube comments, it quickly becomes apparent that a lot of people hate the game. But how much of that is justified dislike, and how much of it can be attributed simply to, well, bandwagoning? Humans often tend towards pack mentality after all. We've all done it at one point or another. To hear some people say it, Dark Souls 2 is the worst game ever. But is that really true? Let's start with some of the most frequent complaints raised against Dark Souls 2, and I'm going to point out that, whilst I do think Dark Souls 2 is a flawed game, I do not personally believe it warrants the almost comical level of hatred some people have towards it. That out of the way, the main complaints levied against Dark Souls 2 are as follows, and of course if you have any of your own, do share below. The game isn't finished, there was a lot of cut content, there was a visual downgrade, bad hitboxes, bad mechanics, such as soul memory. The game doesn't feel right, the controls are clunky or unresponsive, the story makes no sense. The Earthen Peak transition. I've tried to order those roughly in the frequency that I find them being raised, and now I'll go into each briefly, before touching on my own issues with Dark Souls 2, then I'll go into reasons why I like the game to wrap up the video, to end it on a more positive note. So, the game not being finished, cut content, the visual downgrade. Yeah, that's a justified and partially reasonable reaction. Why do I say partially? Well, because no game is ever finished. I promise you that every game ever made has had some form of cut content or unfinished assets. That's simply how games are made. It's simply how movies are made, how books are made, it's how everything is made. I wrote a book when I was 15, I did like 4 or 5 drafts of it, entire characters came and went, entire story arcs, the entire plot changed in drastic ways. And even after I thought I was finished, I ended up going back to it at least twice, because I could. With games, you can't really do that. With movies, you can't really do that. But occasionally you will get a director's cut of a movie that attempts to do just that. So yes, Dark Souls 2 is unfinished and has cut content in the same way that Lord of the Rings is unfinished because Tolkien never made the sequel about Aragorn's descendants. Or how my book has cut content because I cut things that I thought were crap. But on the topic of the visual downgrade, yeah, that happened. There's no real defense for that. At the same time though, it's hardly unique to Dark Souls 2. Is that a legitimate reason to hate the game? Well, you'd have to decide that for yourself, but I do not personally believe it's that big of a deal. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that fake demos are a good thing, false advertising is not a good thing, because I do believe it's misleading, and I do believe it's false advertising. But the difference between, say, Dark Souls 2's initial gameplay reveal and Watch Dogs' initial gameplay reveal, I mean, go and watch them yourself right now. Compare the Dark Souls 2 Cardinal Tower demo with the Watch Dogs gameplay reveal. The Watch Dogs gameplay reveal was essentially a CGI trailer pretending to be gameplay. It had animations and features not actually in the final game. The Dark Souls 2 gameplay features actual gameplay. It's very similar to the final game, it just looks a lot nicer. It has better lighting, better shaders, better things like that, you know? Much nicer visuals, yes, but the only misrepresentation was in the quality of the visuals. Perhaps that isn't a large difference to some people, but to me, it is. Dark Souls 2 had a troubled development cycle, and although we do not know exactly what happened, the general hypothesis is as follows. Game starts development under one director, midway through development the game is essentially scrapped, the director changed, so we're left with a bunch of created assets that need to be retooled in different ways. So perhaps there was mismanagement, but cut content? I think that's a kind of silly complaint because every game has cut content. They didn't reveal much in pre-release footage that wasn't in the final game ultimately. Bloodborne, Dark Souls and Dark Souls 3 all featured pre-release content, whether leaked or not, that included things not in the final game. Bloodborne had trailers for Ebritus being in the cathedral ward where you never actually fight Ebritus. Dark Souls 3 had leaked screenshots of an area that isn't actually in the final game, might be in the Ring City DLC, we don't know. It had a screenshot of the dancer standing upright, apparently an NPC that you talk to. Bloodborne had screenshots of much nicer graphics that were actually in the final game, so this isn't unique to Dark Souls 2, and at the end of the day, it wasn't like they showed us stuff that wasn't in the final game, other than the much nicer visuals with the lighting. So moving on to the next point, bad hitboxes. I think this is usually a complaint raised by people who don't actually know what hitboxes are, or don't understand how they work, or are cherry picking. I've actually made some GIFs of bullshit moments in the games that have been widely shared around the internet, such as being grabbed whilst behind a mimic. So it's a little weird that I'm now tackling this topic and defending it. But yes, bad hitboxes, being hit by things that didn't touch you, being grabbed whilst behind enemies. Are there bad hitboxes in Dark Souls 2? Well, in the way that people are referring to, yes, there is poor hit detection in Dark Souls 2 at times. Just like there's occasionally poor hit detection in Dark Souls 3 and Bloodborne. Is there more of it in Dark Souls 2? Well, you know, I must admit I haven't gone through all of the games and checked every single attack, so I can't say that for certain. The point is, it's a minority of attacks in all of the games. One of the problems would stem from the iframes and how they work in Dark Souls 2, because there are plenty of examples of great hitboxes and great hit detection too. But yes, it's kind of nonsense when you are standing behind a mimic and you get sucked into its grab, but that's not so much a problem of hitboxes and more how the game handles its animations, such as when I try to dodge Alon's thrusting grab attack and I get sucked back into it. It did hit me, it just looks really stupid because I was moving rapidly whilst it happened, so the animation doesn't look all that consistent. So yes, Dark Souls 2 has some bad hitboxes. Dark Souls 3, Bloodborne, Dark Souls 1, they have some bad hitboxes too. They also have some great hitboxes. Next up, bad mechanics, how invasions work, soul memory and so forth. Yeah, I can't really argue that. Soul memory was a good idea but poorly implemented. The concept behind soul memory was that it would stop players from remaining at low levels and becoming twinks. In other words, like in the first Dark Souls where you get invaded in the Undeadburg by a player using plus 10 armor, plus 10 weapons, and you can't do anything to him. Whether or not that was a problem that needed fixing is up for debate, but From did find more elegant ways around it than soul memory, simply by having equipment scale to the host's level. Dark Souls 2 also featured the first example of passwords in the Souls franchise. Whilst in Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3 we can simply use a literal password in the menus to play with our friends, Dark Souls 2 tried to implement it in a more lore-friendly, albeit convoluted way of using the God Rings. Whilst I love the passwords, I do think Dark Souls 2 had a good concept going with the rings. It was lore-friendly and it also punished you in the sense that you had to give up a ring slot to play with your friends. Now, I think it would make sense if we simply used a special soapstone. This soapstone is unique in that markings etched onto it will resonate between worlds or something like that. Effectively a password system but bound to an item that you get at the start of the game. It would give us all the benefits of passwords but also be lore friendly and less immersion breaking. I don't often run into complaints about some of the other mechanics, like how some of the other stats work, but that's probably because a lot of them are actually good mechanics, but more on that later. The feel of the game. This is the most subjective complaint. Here is what my friend has to say on it. Movement feels slow and not tight. I noticed when you leveled up agility and stuff, you can move more like Dark Souls 1, so that's interesting in an annoying way that your character literally gets better by leveling up in a gameplay sense, instead of just like damage and ability wise. The sprint feels slow, life gems trivialize the PvE, weapons are more quantity over quality, and you have like no stamina, at least it runs out fast and that isn't fun. With a great hammer I can attack like 3 times, then I'm out of stamina. And when you're out of stamina, you're penalised like you can't sprint until your bar is full. I think the best objective complaint here would be life gems. They do trivialise PvE in some ways. Once you're an hour or so into the game, it's trivial to have 99 life gems on your character at all times, meaning you never need to worry about healing. Most of the other complaints I would consider subjective. It's true that your character can't sprint if you exhaust your stamina, and it's true that stamina depletes at a much faster rate in Dark Souls 2 than the other games. But is that a bad thing? Well, no. It's a gameplay decision, it's a design choice. Why even include stamina if not to make it important? The game Nioh gets this very much, as ki in that game is a very important asset to manage. But in Dark Souls 3 and Bloodborne, stamina is very rarely something you need to actually worry about and actively manage. It's essentially a you can't spam R1 forever mechanic. It's a you can't sprint forever mechanic. By all means, there's nothing wrong with preferring how the other games manage stamina, but I don't think it's a flaw of Dark Souls 2 that you do need to manage it more actively than the other games. For it's built around that concept. Stamina is supposed to be a gameplay mechanic that you have to keep an eye on, that you have to manage. As for movement feeling clunky, slow and the likes, again, that is so subjective that it's only really going to be a personal issue. Yes, Dark Souls 2 does control very different to Dark Souls 1, it feels different in how you move. And yes, Dark Souls 2 does feature a fairly large dead zone. Control responsiveness, it's not really a problem. Yeah, maybe if you're a professional Quake player who plays on a professional monitor at 500 frames a second, you might notice a difference. But to the average player, they would probably notice it as much as they would notice the difference between a TV response time and a professional gaming monitor response time. And note, I'm not talking about frames per second here, I'm not talking about the difference between 30 frames per second and 60 frames per second, but the response time from controller input to character action. Moving on to the story making no sense, and this is where I'll transition into my own complaints about Dark Souls 2. The story of Dark Souls 2 was initially somewhat confusing, yes, but the themes it presented were not. It was very open-ended, just like the other games. But here's where I take umbrage with Dark Souls 2, and yes, let's start with Earthen Peak and how you go up an elevator and end up in the Iron Keep. That makes no sense. The only possible explanation is dreams, dude. And time's convoluted, dude, which isn't satisfying. A few people might bring up the transition after fighting Maria in the Clock Tower in Bloodborne, where you then come out into landscape that makes zero sense. Yeah, it doesn't make sense, but in Bloodborne's case, you are very explicitly inside a warped reality, that of a dream. You can look under the waters of the fishing village and you can see the top of Yharnam City, because you're in a dream. In Dark Souls 2, yes, you do fall through a portal at the start of the game, you might be in a dream the whole time, but usually that doesn't happen in the game. Iron Keep is one very isolated example. It feels perplexing and not in a good way. It's not a game-breaking bug, but it does really hurt the immersion, because nothing talks about it. They could have had an NPC, they could have had... what is that guy, Magarold of Lanifear, the NPC in the Iron Keep? They could have had him include a line of dialogue saying, "Didn't you find it strange how you came to this place?" They could have had an item, they could have had anything explaining it, but they didn't, so it feels like it's not intentional. Another complaint that I do share with some people would be too many bosses, or rather, too many humanoid bosses. Personally, I don't care about the bosses being humanoid, but I do think Dark Souls 2 has too many bosses, with not enough emphasis on each one being truly unique and engaging. I'm not saying Dark Souls 1 or 3 are immune from this either. Hey, fighting an Asylum Demon like 3 times. That was fun. Then there's adaptability, or agility. Agility is effectively tying iframes to a stat, and I think that's a terrible idea. The idea of making your character more agile, or stronger, or able to carry more equipment makes sense. You infuse magical energy into your character's muscles to make them lift more weight or whatever, sure, but iframes? Makes no sense. The game should have given you max iframes from the start, and simply had agility impact your character in other ways, such as roll distance or indeed increasing the speed with which you use items, and it does that. I just cannot express how much I think it's a bad idea to tie iframes to a stat. But you know what? Let's talk about what Dark Souls 2 does right before finishing this video up. The game has a huge variety of areas, and tried to play more into both verticality and light and darkness, such as the torches for example. It had server-based matchmaking, unlike Dark Souls 1. It received much faster and more frequent balance adjustments too. Remember how long it took them to make the Darkwood Grain Ring not the most broken thing in the game? It was at least 6 months in Dark Souls 1. At least. Elemental builds and weapon upgrades had a lot more versatility and options than the first game. It has the best selection of armor and weapons of any game in the Souls franchise. Dark Souls 3 has 16 straight swords at time of writing, not including the second DLC. Dark Souls 2 has 18, and they have more variety between them in terms of moveset. Speaking of movesets, Dark Souls 2 gave us power stancing, a very cool and interesting mechanic that I would argue works a lot better than weapon arts in Dark Souls 3. Weapon arts are essentially the things from Dark Souls 1, the super attacks that use durability. Power stancing really could change up your playstyle. How about magic? I don't think anyone can argue that Dark Souls or Dark Souls 3 has better magic than Dark Souls 2. Thanks to a huge number of spells and items that support the build, magic uses are actually viable in Dark Souls 2. I've been able to do pure sorcery in Dark Souls 2, which works so much better than Dark Souls 3. In Dark Souls 1, it only really worked if you were using Dark Bead and maybe Pursuers, things that were broken. They were just one-shot players, but when players figured out how to dodge them, it became unviable again. And in Dark Souls 3, you'll be hard pressed to make a lightning spear more effective than a wooden arrow. Dark Souls 2 was the first game in the series to have cloth physics and dynamic lighting. Aside from being the only console Dark Souls to be 60 frames per second, it's also the first game in the series to actually support 60 frames per second at all. Speaking of which, the Dark Souls 2 PC port is so much better than the Dark Souls 1 PC port. It actually works. Although granted, it took them forever to fix the durability glitch, and it wasn't really that great that they made you pay again for Scholar of the First Sin. And I didn't talk about that earlier, did I? Much like stamina, some people hate how durability works in Dark Souls 2, because it's actually a mechanic. In Dark Souls 1 and 3 and Bloodborne, it might as well effectively be removed, like in Neo, because it serves zero realistic purpose other than to stop you spamming Moonlight Greatsword in Dark Souls 1. It means that occasionally you will have to go and repair your weapon. Dark Souls 2, you could actually run a build that focused on destroying enemy durability in PvP. They actually had that mechanic there for a purpose. See, at the end of the day, I think that's why I can't hate Dark Souls 2. The game tried to be different. It tried to do something new, instead of just making the first game again with new levels. There were plenty of great ideas for Dark Souls 2. Some were poorly executed, true, but I do not think it's fair to begrudge a development team for trying something new. They tried to make stamina and durability play an active role in the game, instead of just being essentially pointless game mechanics. Magic was far more viable, and we got the best sorcerer in Strayed. They tried to make more viable playstyles than simply R1 spam with a fast weapon, which, let's face it, Bloodborne in Dark Souls 3, R1 spam with a fast weapon is the best way to play the game. We got a fascinating new look at the impact of the curse, and possible salves in our talks with Aldia. He and Vendrick, by the way, have some of the best dialogue in the series in my opinion. They tried to give us a new story whilst not invalidating choices we made in the first game, keeping similar themes but expanding the scope of the world. Dark Souls 3 on the other hand, it did the opposite. It didn't expand the scope of the world, it shrank it. Quite literally, the world is shrinking, converging on Lothric in Dark Souls 3. Instead of giving us new and exciting things, we got Anor Londo again. We got effectively the same story as the first game, with a few minor alterations. I don't hate Dark Souls 3 by any means, but I found that incredibly disappointing in the base game, and the DLC that was retreading the much familiar ground. I am very excited for the Ring DLC, the Ring City DLC that is. That's the reason I wrote this script, recorded this script, made this video before the DLC, because I want to compare before and after. I'm really hoping that the Ring City is going to change my feelings on the story of Dark Souls 3, as much as Scholar changed my feelings on Dark Souls 2. So yes, in summary, I can't hate Dark Souls 2 for trying something new and different. I think it's better to try and innovate and fail than stick to what you know and succeed. And at the end of the day, Dark Souls 3 played too safe for me, played it too safe. I think Dark Souls 3 is a better game than Dark Souls 2, but I think Dark Souls 2 is a better sequel. Great ideas, poorly implemented. Dark Souls 3, lazy ideas well implemented. There was nothing new and exciting in Dark Souls 3 in terms of gameplay mechanics. They played it much too safe. I love both games though, along with Bloodborne and the first Dark Souls, along with Demon Souls 2. But obviously the only reason I actually like Dark Souls 2 is because my shield's in the game. Phoenix Palmer represent.